Okay, welcome all to our network webinar. Rick and Jason are presenting to us today. They're also going to present to the Predictive Services Group in a few weeks' time. But part of it's around some new work that they've been doing.
Joining the conference is
how we might be able to predict
Steve Ward.
The extreme fire weather days that we all so much dread. I'll hand over to you, Rick and Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's Jason here. I'll start off. Rick will chime in later on. We've also got Rachel Badlin, who's a postdoc at UNSW. She's going to chime in at an opportune moment to tell us about some of the research she's been doing as well. So, yeah, so basically the idea is to take you through this blow-up fire outlook model, and I guess a little bit of information on the aspects of it most relevant to F-bands. So if we flick through to the next slide there, just gives you an outline for what we've got in mind. Start off with some definitions, go on to develop.
Joining the conference is
Donna Sweetman.
Talk about the way the model is implemented, some of the data sets which are involved in implementing the model, and then I'll hand over to Rick and he's going to tell you about the formal trial and some of the future directions we're looking at. So if we just go to the next slide, which should say preface.
The following has left the conference.
Donna Sweetman.
So I guess the philosophy behind this whole thing, sort of looking back to the beginning of its development, was the realisation that when a fire blows up, it often doesn't follow the current suite of operational models. Okay, so things like MacArthur, we know, generally under-predict these blow-up events. But really, any of the steady-state models that are in use at the moment are going to suffer from the same sort of limitations. So what that means is that we're currently in the situation where we've only got fairly limited capacity to model these dangerous
Joining the conference
fire
is
events.
Donna Sweetman.
So one of the things in particular we've been interested in is this, and I guess it's a kind of a worldwide acknowledgement now that dynamic fire behaviours are really important in these sorts of blow-up events. So the BUFO model, the blow-up fire outlook model, is really kind of trying to acknowledge some of those dynamic fire behaviours in a more formal way, which gives us a enhanced predictive ability around these sorts of events. So if we can skip to the next slide. So when it comes to dynamic fire behaviour, there's been a lot of, I guess, fairly ambiguous use of the terms around dynamic fire behaviour and extreme fire development in the literature. Some of the terms have only been very loosely defined, and this has led, I guess, to a lot of uncertainty about what we're actually talking about when various terms are used, and in the worst cases this has even sort of resulted in misuse of some of the terminology. So what we sort of took
joining the conference is
what we took great care to do is have a look at the formal definitions of terms around dynamic fire behaviour and extreme fire development, and try and base these as much as we can.
Joining the conference is
Dan Jones.
All right, so we come through to that next slide. Should be steady state versus dynamic fire spread. So this is really, I guess, the big distinction that we need to get sort of clear in our minds before we can go much further. So this idea of steady state fire spread, which is the one which is really modelled in all of the operational models that we currently have, and there's this sort of underlying assumption in developing those models that for a given set of values of your environmental variables, of fuel, terrain and weather, given a unique set of those variables, you can use them to define a unique set of fire behaviour descriptors. Okay, so rates of spread, flame height, things like that. Usually these fire behaviour descriptors that you get from these sorts of steady state models are interpreted as the expected or the mean value that you're looking at. Dynamic fire behaviour, on the other hand, is really referring to cases where even though your environmental conditions aren't changing very much at all, or at all, you can get substantially different fire behaviour occurring. Okay, so with little or no change in the fuel, terrain or the weather, the fire behaviour can exhibit significant changes. The thing about dynamic fire spread is it occurs in response to pyroconvective interactions that take place between not just the surface but also the upper level weather, the terrain and the fire itself. And the tricky thing about them is they often include these environmental thresholds. So under a particular sort of day with certain weather conditions, for example, it'll only be certain parts of the terrain which are going to be prone to these sorts of dynamic fire behaviours. I guess the more we look into these dynamic fire behaviours and the more we understand their thresholds, the better we're getting at being able to predict or identify which parts of the terrain are prone to these sorts of effects, and this is kind of what's led us into the operational sort of side of the blow-up model that we're talking about today. So we'll jump to the next slide. It should be extreme wildfire. So here we're formally defining the concept of an extreme wildfire. So this is a definition we put into a paper a year or so back. Fire is due to that sort of coupling with the atmosphere. It means that you're going to open yourself up to a whole lot of other undesirable processes, such as erratic and unpredictable winds, downbursts, things like that. Mixing down of dry air as through the convection column, sending air back down to the surface and the downflow. Highly increased potential for ember generation and transport, and if you get to the sort of pyro-CV stage of things, then you're getting things like dry lightning as well, which are likely to start other fires. So just all the sort of stuff that can ruin your day. So key concept in that definition was an extreme wildfire is one which couples with the atmosphere through the development of blow-up fire events. So if we skip through to the next slide, we formally define a blow-up fire event as the formation of deep or widespread flaming in an atmospheric...
Joining the conference is name not recorded.
...allows the fire to reach the lifted condensation level. I'll cover that in a little bit. And also that's how that coupling is enhanced with the atmosphere. So just to, I guess, contrast that definition with the one which is in the NWCG glossary, you can see down the bottom there. Blow-up fire event they characterise as a sudden increase in fire line intensity and rate of spread, sufficient to preclude direct control. We've sort of got the same thing encapsulated in our definition, though what we're specifically saying is it's not so much just fire line intensity that's important, it's the formation of these deep flaming zones. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll explain what I mean.
Joining the conference is
Kevin White.
So I think you should be seeing now just a little dodgy picture that I drew showing ordinary fire propagation. You have the wind pushing the fire and most of the activity is just at the front of the fire. I think if you click through, there'll be another little picture appear where the fire is no longer spreading just as all the activity along the front, so it's transitioned from a frontal fire behaviour pattern to an aerial fire behaviour pattern. So in the second picture, you've got a large tract of your landscape actively involved in fire, and that's what we refer to as deep flaming. Okay, so that's sort of my hokey PowerPoint art version of it. If you skip to the next slide, you'll see a real example.
joining the conference is
Andrew Dean.
So the example we're seeing there is from the Wombalong fire in 2013. And so if you have a look at the picture there, you've got a clear sort of blob of enhanced orange, okay, so a large area of active flame, and that's in contrast to other parts of the fire where you can sort of see just a thin line at the front or the flank or the back of the fire there, which is your normal sort of frontal pattern of fire spread. So deep flaming, as I said, it's really just referring to the ability of the fire to form these widespread aerial flaming zones. Over the years, we've sort of identified a number of triggers which can produce deep flaming. Wind change and strong winds, anything which is going to deepen your flaming zone is going to produce deep flaming. Wind change and strong winds, efficient at producing deep flaming, perhaps. It's not really that sure, but certainly the ones further on in the list which are actually examples of dynamic modes of fire propagation, are much more efficient at producing deep flaming. So these things are, vorticity-driven lateral spread, which I hope most of you are fully aware of now. Eruptive spread or flame attachment, which is kind of the slope, extreme slope-driven fire spread. Mass spotting and fire coalescence, which is something we've been looking at in a CRC project. And I guess a recent addition to the list is, I would say, overzealous anthropogenic ignitions, or other words, misuse of a drip torch, basically just introducing too much fire into the landscape in too short a time. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Rachel Badler now. She's a postdoc who's working with us at UNSW, and she's been looking at some coupled fire atmosphere modelling, trying to really understand the importance of deep flaming in driving these extreme plume development occurrences. So I'll hand over to Rachel.
Hello. So, if you just go forward to the next slide, it's recent research. So, as Jason's told you a bit about deep flaming, we realised that it's first recognised in 2003 Canberra fires as an important mechanism for the generation of pyro-CBs, or fire thunderstorms which are generated from a heat source such as fire. And so what we wanted to do was to better understand the relationship between the size and intensity of the area of deep flaming, so how strong the fire is, and the relationship between that and the thunderstorm that it produced, the height of the cloud, the size of the cloud, etc. So what we did to that end, we ran a few models, different fire sizes, starting with a 150-metre radius fire and going all the way up to 1.5 kilometre radius fire, so a pretty big one. We took each of those fires and we then changed the intensity of the fire. So we had a cool fire, if you like, at 25 kilowatts per square metre, one at 50 and one at 100, which we call the hot fire, if you like. And we also then looked at what happened when we placed them in different atmospheric stabilities as well. But we won't talk so much about that today. So the blue plots you can see in front of you, if we look, for example, at the left-hand group of, or block of 4, this shows the hot fire, and as you can see, with the 150-metre radius, we get a fairly small, low plume, but then as the size of the fire increases, we see that not only does the cloud base rise, which is the bottom of the cloud, but also the top of the plume as well. So basically, that's showing that the larger fire generates a taller, more vigorous plume. We also compared the intensities, so each block of 4 is each of the intensities. So on the right block of 4 is the cool fire, and in the middle is the 50-watt fire, and as we can see, the plumes again become taller and more vigorous with increased intensity. We used the Weather Research and Forecast model, the WRF model, for this, and I've summarised sort of the main findings in the graph below. So this shows the maximum temperature anomaly, so the heat within the plume, if you like, over each of the model runs. And so the red line shows the hot fire, the dark blue is the warm, and the light blue is the cool. And as we can see, again, as the fire size increases and as the intensity increases, the plume height increases. So this actually illustrates very nicely why a lot of scientists use this measure of total energy released to determine the pyro-CB. And the total energy released is really just, if you like, the two, intensity and the fire size multiplied by each other as the product. So if we flick through to the next slide, which is the coupled fire atmosphere model 2, and we see a graph, and on that graph is just the plume height on the vertical scale, and along the bottom we see total energy released. And don't worry too much about the stabilities, but what you can see from this is as the total energy released increases, so does the plume height. And so you can understand why this has been used as a measure in the pyroconvective potential. However, the caveat for this, I must say is that all of these are circular fires. So what we wanted to look at was how does this change with shape? So as we get a larger perimeter around the same fire area, does it change the height of the plume? So if you flick through one more time, there should be some different shapes there. You should see a circle, a square, and 4 rectangles. So the top 3 would represent areas of deep flaming, those sort of shapes. And the bottom 3 would probably represent fire lines. And if you flick through again, you'll get a dotted line showing the 1 kilometre, 100 kilowatt line. This basically shows you the line where that 1 kilometre circular fire sits. So what we did was we made all of these other fire shapes the same total energy released as that fire. And if you keep flicking through, you'll then see something that says square, and a rectangle, and then rectangle, rectangle, rectangle. There should be 4 rectangles and a square in red writing. So what we see, though, is that the shape has a very big impact on the height of the plume, that the areas of deep flaming, the square and the 4:1 ratio rectangle, produce plumes that are well up into the troposphere, which is marked by about the 12 kilometre height. The 3 other rectangles, which would represent fire lines, basically do not reach that high, and some would not develop for very long. They'd be very short-lived systems. So we see that the shape of the fire is extremely important. If you flick through to the next screen, there should be a graph with lots of red dots. Okay, so what we did, we took the plume height on the vertical axis, and along the bottom on the x-axis we have it's the ratio of the perimeter to the area that it encloses. And when we actually did the correlation between these 2 variables, we see a very, very strong connection between basically a larger perimeter, so the higher the log IPR number means the larger the perimeter or the more irregular shape, so thinner, like a fire line, whereas close to the 1 would be a more circular fire. So we can see that if you have a fire line, you're less likely to get the generation of the pyro-CVs. And I think I'm about to now hand back to Jason for lifted condensation level.
All right, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, the bottom line of that is really that, you know, the simulations that Rachel's been doing is really confirming the hypothesis we have that the depth of the flaming zone is a key contributor to large plume development. So if we skip through to the next slide, this is a concept which came up in the blow-up fire definition. So a blow-up fire was one which we had enough deep and widespread flaming to get us to the lifted condensation level. And I think probably most of you know this, so apologies if I'm telling you how to suck eggs, but just for those who sort of need reminding, the lifted condensation level is just the level in the atmosphere to which a lifted parcel of surface air would become saturated just due to 88. There's a little bit of research going on around this at the moment. Craig Clements in San Jose has done a lot sort of questioning whether the lifted condensation level is the appropriate level to be talking about where you get your plume starting to condense. Some people favour the convective condensation level, and I think Craig's just talked about the plume condensation level. They're all going to be roughly around that LCL height though. So if we skip to the next slide, just the next slide here, this is really just to make the distinction between pyrocumulus and pyrocumulonimbus. So what we have in that picture there...
Joining the conference is name not recorded.
What we have in that picture is just a sugarcane fire in Hawaii, so nothing particularly troublesome in terms of fire suppression or getting away or anything like that, not a nasty fire. But you can see what's happened is if we just click through, you should see a little red line up here with the cloud base, indicating the cloud base. You can see the fire is getting up to that condensation level. Cloud is starting to form. And what happens as that cloud forms is the water is condensing, and that's releasing the latent heat of condensation. So you get an extra sort of influx of heat coming into the system at that stage, which then drives your plume higher. Okay, makes it more buoyant. But That's a pyrocumulus. I mean, I think I've certainly seen them form over fairly innocuous hazard reduction burns, and generally not all that much to worry about. If we skip through to the next slide, we see a slightly more extreme example of pyroconvection, and something which is clearly a pyrocumulonimbus. So just taking the definition from the American Met Society glossary, pyrocumulonimbus is an extreme manifestation of a pyrocumulus cloud generated by the heat of a wildfire, often rises to the upper troposphere or lower stratosphere. And I think if you just click through another couple of times, basically what that means is pyro-CB is essentially a fire plume which has developed thunderstorm characteristics. The clear difference between the pyrocumulus on the last slide and what's going on in this slide is that the degree of pyroconvection that's apparent in those pictures is a lot more violent. Okay, so winds are going to be a lot more erratic and gusty, and your plume is punching much higher into the atmosphere, which means you're going to have more likelihood of involving upper weather systems into your fire spread. So I guess the last thing I sort of want to cover is the concept of atmospheric stability. And again, I'm aware that most of you are probably across this, but if you just click through the next slide, just got a little bit of an animation that I doctored up. So atmospheric stability, we're really talking about the degree to which the atmosphere resists turbulence and vertical motion. And hopefully you can see there's a little brown sort of well with a little ball in it. If we just click through there a couple of times, what's happening is we're taking the ball and we're just moving it a little bit. Okay, so we move it up the wall of the well there, and if we let it go, all that's going to happen is it's going to roll backwards and forwards and eventually settle back down into the bottom of the well. So this is an example of a stable system. Okay, so any little perturbation you give to the ball is going to automatically restore itself. Okay. Similarly, if you've got an unstable atmosphere, if you perturb an air parcel up or down, it's just going to wobble back and want to end up back in the same place it started. On the other hand, if you click through, you should see another little brown hill appear on the right with a ball on top of it, and this is going to signify an unstable situation. So if we take that ball and click through and just give it a little bit of a nudge to the left or the right, in this case the right, if we nudge it that way, then there's no way that ball is going to ever return to where it started. And if we click through, you'll see what happens. It just rolls off. And so this would be analogous to an unstable atmosphere, whereas if we were to perturb an air parcel vertically, it would not want to come back to where it started. It would just continue to rise. Okay, and of course that's got to do with the differences in adiabatic lapse rates and so on, as you all probably know. Just click through a couple of times. It's just a little few words there to sum it up. Basically what an unstable atmosphere means is that any air parcel that's perturbed upwards will continue to rise. Now, if you stick a fire under an air parcel, you're making it more buoyant, and so you're giving it that little perturbation upwards, and what happens in an unstable atmosphere is that air parcel will want to continue to rise. So what that means is you've already got this mechanism for your plume development to be enhanced. So if we click through to the next slide, just to, I guess, emphasise why atmospheric instability is critically important for extreme wildfire development. Well, really it's when you have the case where your convective cap is less than the pyrogenic temperature anomaly for the lifted parcel. Okay, so if your fire is making your air parcel hot enough so that it can get to the convective cap before it stops its upward motion, then you're going to get those other things like latent heat release kicking in and an extra kick to your plume development. So as far as atmospheric instability goes, we have things like the Haynes indices and the C. Haynes index more recently to try and get a handle on the instability environment. Just something we've been, I guess, becoming more aware of recently is the fact that when you've got a bad fire danger day in Australia, the lifted condensation level will often be higher than the 700 hectopascal level, which is the highest level used in calculation of Haynes indices. Okay, so in that sort of situation, the C. Haynes calculation that you do will be looking at variables totally within the mixed layer. Under that sort of situation, probably prudent to say that the Haynes indices, the C. Haynes index, is probably acting more as just another version of a fire danger index rather than a stability index. Okay, we're really interested in about what happens above the LCL. So it's just a little caveat for what will come later on. Okay, so if we just skip through to the next slide, we can start talking a little bit about, I guess, bringing those concepts together and how we ended up with the BUFO, or the blow-up fire outlook model. Really, I mean, I think Rachel's research is demonstrating this fairly well. The concept of a blow-up fire really relies on this concept of deep flaming being involved and it happening in an atmospheric setting which is conducive to enhanced plume development. Okay, so just a little equation there just to sum it up. You get a blow-up fire when you've got deep flaming combining with some level of atmospheric instability or other shifting mechanism. The precursor for a blow-up fire, though, of course, is that you need to have a fire going, and from what we've been seeing in our studies is that you need to have elevated or raised fire danger rating. Now, I've put raised in inverted commas there because when I say raised, it's probably only something like very high. We still need to tie that down, but certainly there's been blow-up fires recorded in situations where fire danger ratings were only, well, less than severe. So that's kind of the basis for where we move over to the BUFO model. Hand over to Rick to cover this. So if we click to the next slide, you should see a flowchart which is the BUFO model, and I'll let Rick step through that with you.
Yeah, hi. So we should be seeing that flowchart now, and the flowchart is what we call the process model. You start at the beginning and you ask a series of questions, and the answer to each question, yes or no, puts you on a different path, and some paths will take you through to a conclusion, which is an outlook for a blow-up to happen. Some paths will loop you back. So if you think about being in an incident management team, you might have a routine in which you cycle through this, which certainly is every time a forecast is updated for the weather part, but whenever better observations come in from the fireground, you might loop through again. It's designed to loop through on the sort of schedule that's required for the incident you're involved in. So you'll see there are animations which will show up on the slide with red text if we swipe through. The starting point is indicated. It's got a number 1 on it. That's question 1. The questions are numbered through to question 9. You should see a red box outlining a group in the middle labelled potential for deep flaming. So questions 2 through to 8 are all looking at assessing whether you've got a potential for deep flaming to occur. And right at the end you've got question 9 about the instability environment. And of question 9, if you reach question 9 and it's a yes, you end up with a blow-up fire outlook prediction. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, which is headed the BUFO model, the model ties together a number of identified processes that can produce deep flaming, as Jason was talking about. The model is tuned from case studies and it requires specialist implementation. And I've got an asterisk there because that's something I talk about right at the end of the presentation. At the bottom of that slide you'll see we've got a couple of references there, so as we developed the model we made sure that it was published as peer-reviewed work. And if we go to the next slide, the BUFO model implementation. We need to be forecasting the potential for blow-up fire events using data on surface weather from Bureau Met or fire agencies, data on terrain, and we've got some material online about specialised terrain analysis on our high fire risk website, and there's a URL for that at the end of the presentation. You need information on the fire evolution, so fire agencies and remote sensing. And you might have picked up from that that dialogue with BUFOs or the local fire weather forecaster can be essential elements in doing this. It's not just looking at some websites. The fire can be as important as the weather in generating dynamic fire spread. And the final thing, atmospheric stability, data from Bureau Met and remote sensing. So we do assessments in the BUFO model, and we record any operational application of the model, whether it's a positive or a negative outcome. And in some circumstances we issue alerts, so advice given to operations about the potential for blow-up fire event. I think there are some people who dread getting phone calls from me on days of raised fire danger. Now often these alerts are conditional because of incomplete information. You can easily imagine fires occurring in places where you don't have radar coverage or there's all sorts of gaps in the data, in which case you might be able to say if certain things were to happen, then there would be an alert issued. Now in the next slide we discuss some of the remote sensing material that's vital to doing this work, and there are a lot of things in this slide. We use radar, fixed and mobile radar, to assess plume dynamics, and a lot of you would have seen some really interesting research papers in recent years showing exactly what you can pick up if you get radar right next to the fire. AWSs and PAWs are critical for analysing how the fire danger index trends through the diurnal cycle. Data from HIM or RE8, MODIS, VIIRS and Calypso, Landsat and Sentinel. There's a range of different satellites that provide different data that can be used for predictive material or for confirmation material. And really a lot of people in the fire game in Australia are only playing at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the potential for using satellite data. Right next to our office here we have a thing called the wind profiler, which is absolutely brilliant for getting an idea about what the wind profile is. It's basically an upward-looking LiDAR, and some of you would be familiar with Byram's work from the 50s on the different wind profiles and their ability to cause blow-ups. The radiosonde is the best tool for looking at the instability environment, and that's absolutely brilliant, having New South Wales RFS flying them around the ACT area from time to time. Absolutely essential intelligence. Photographs from the fireground, air observers, field observers. The line scans are an amazing tool for learning from fires, let alone their operational value. A lot of the science we've done has come about because there have been line scans. And of course, if the line scans overlap and you can develop an understanding of time sequence, it's all the better. So if we look at the next slide, confirming a blow-up event. So while the fire's going, if you see escalating radar plumes, if you see hotspots in Himawari in visible or near-infrared bands, if you see deep flaming coming out of your line scans, if you see the dense smoke plume that we've often talked about in recent years that arises from vorticity-driven lateral spread events, and if the atmospheric scientists around the globe, led by Mike Fromm, get excited online, then you know you've got a confirmed blow-up event. We've even confirmed them using lightning detection data coming from fire thunderstorms. After the event, you can look at satellite data for uniform burn scars, and if the burn scar especially is aligned with the upper winds and not necessarily the surface winds. I'm pleased to announce a really hard-working IT guy here has finally got our online component of the webinar working in this room. So yeah, he deserves a beer, that guy. So I'll leave the slide on remote control. I won't take over driving it from here if that's not a problem. Okay, the next slide, formal trial. If we can move on. Yep. So we did the science, we developed the model, and it was absolutely critical to us that it was confirmed. It's a vital part of doing science that you come up with ideas and try and prove or disprove them. So we ran a formal trial for 3 years, working with Sydney, with New South Wales Rural Fire Service, as well as the ACT Rural Fire Service. We had, in that period, 23 days of concern, where we had to get serious with the BUFO model. And as a result of the trial, our trial statistics, probability of detection 100%, the false alarm rate 33%, and the true negative rate 100%. So those are fairly pleasing results, and given a caveat that it's a small data set, we decided that that was a success. We're actually pleased to have insufficient data because as fire people we don't want the community to be threatened by these big events, but as scientists we need data, so there's a little ethical conflict there. I've got a URL in the slide where you can download a poster that we presented in the Melbourne conference a year or so back that the IAWF ran, so I guess when the materials are circulated you can download that PDF. And we're actually in the process of submitting a formal paper on the trial for publication. So the next slide. In the paper we talk about a case study, or a few case studies, and there's some material from one of them here that I'd just like to quickly refer you to. The right-hand part of it is a series of maps that my computer brews up. It interrogates the Bureau of Met's full AWS network and turns them into intelligence products. So the last panel there, the red bit, that diagonal red band, is an area where it assessed that fuel moisture content was critically low. In Western Tasmania it assessed that fuel moisture content was quite high. And the third last panel, the different shades of blue, that shows areas where the wind strength is up. If the wind strength exceeds 25 kilometres an hour, then there's an expectation of lee slope eddy winds kicking in, as an example. So on the left-hand side, there's another panel there, which is where we do what used to be called the McHarg overlay. We just overlay all the different components from the model and see where, nowadays they call it the Swiss cheese model, where the holes line up. And it's an annotated hand-drawn map, and that's what we use for looking for fires that could be likely to produce a blow-up. If you see a fire through the holes in the stacked Swiss cheese slices, then it's something you should be looking at carefully. Now the next slide, we talk about limitations, unknowns and improvements to the model. What we don't want is in 40 years' time this thing to be looking exactly like it does today. We know there's a lot of science going on. The more case studies we do, the better the science will be. And we know the model is going to need to improve as new findings come through. So our goal is to improve this model. And I'll just talk about a few things where we think there might be improvements coming. So if you have a look at the next slide, last year I spent some time in British Columbia with one of the deployments, and the atmospheric scientists got very excited on August 12th over there. They really did get excited because they now call it the mother of all PyroCb events. And the question became, what was the cause of deep flaming in play over there on that day? And nothing on our list ticked the boxes. So I'm having a good hard look at that, and there's a process I'm calling interior ignition. And anyone who was over there, especially doing FBN or aerial work, would know that days after the fire had gone through, whole slabs of the landscape could light up again. And the net effect of this going on looks like it's equivalent to deep flaming. Different sort of deep flaming, but nevertheless it drove the violent pyroconvection. And over the years I've heard a lot of discussion about fires in Western Australia which seem to be able to burn for a month or more. And when this is happening you can get increases in grass curing, increases in drought indices, so bits that didn't burn on the first pass of the fire can become flammable and drive this interior ignition process. In the next slide, moisture is something that is a hot topic of discussion amongst the scientists studying these things. Incipient thunderstorm formation in the region around the PyroCb is often observed. Equally, very dry air can be observed around PyroCb. So the question becomes how much of ambient moisture as opposed to pyrogenic moisture is required, or is there a full spectrum of things in between those two extremes that can be present to let a pyroCu form. We've got ideas, other people have other ideas, and there's a lot of discussion yet to be had before this one's fully locked down. But if you look at the imagery on different things, you can see that full spectrum seems to be in play. The image on the slide is the 2003 Canberra event, and there's some dry air around the fires. If you look at the next slide, solitons are an amazing thing. They were discussed in the analyses done after the 2009 fires in Victoria, and after we got Himawari 8 satellite up and running, we've increasingly seen these things bouncing around the countryside. The graphic I've got there is from the Gulf country, and it doesn't involve a fire. But in the lower left side, you can see there's a soliton moving through, and as it goes, it's spitting up towering cumulus cloud. There's another one coming through from the top right, and in the sequence of imagery where the two intersect, the two bits of instability add together and allow a full-blown thunderstorm to form. So our question is partial instability from a fire with partial instability from a soliton added together enough to breach the convective cap and allow a pyroCu to form, or a blow-up fire event to form underneath. How common are solitons? We've seen them in a number of the fires we've looked at. It's something that we'd like people to keep looking for as we go through this summer or next summer or whatever, because I've got a sneaking suspicion they're going to be quite important. If we look at the next slide, the hydraulic jump. Now, we were talking about hydraulic jumps being important in the plateau area in the British Columbia between the Coast Range and the Rockies. And the image I've got there is from the fires a couple of months back around California, and it's a Santa Ana wind event with a whole lot of fire causing a whole lot of damage. But you can see the fires going from left to right, and it comes down off the high country, is a fairly smooth flow, and when it reaches the red arrow, the smooth laminar flow breaks up and the thing becomes a lot more turbulent. And towards the bottom of the image you can even see what looks like a towering cloud brewing up. So where the hydraulic jump occurs and you switch to more turbulence, is it acting like a soliton? Is it inducing an extra level of instability? And I think we've got a lot more playing to do with this one before we come up with any strong conclusions. So on the next slide, one of the things we're playing with is an index to look at the potential for pyroCbs, and it's going to need a few characteristics. Unlike Haynes, it's not going to be relative to the ground, it's going to be relative to the LCL. It'll need a fire danger index element, and I think that's probably going to be the mixing depth. It'll need to look at the dew point depression above the LCL. In other words, as air mixes down to replace what's going up in the plume, is it bringing down drier air and exacerbating fire conditions on the surface? And we'll also need to look at the magnitude of the convective cap. The stronger the cap, the more thermal anomaly you need to bypass it. And there's a URL there where I've got a little bit of JavaScript that includes the current thinking of what a pyroCb index might be, and people are welcome to play if they give me some feedback on it, because I think we've got a long way to go yet to lock this one down. So the next slide, we're coming to the really critical bit for today's audience, model utilisation. So BUFO is currently the only formal model to holistically predict blow-up fire events. We all know of instances where people have said this fire is going to blow up. But what I mean by holistically predicting fire events is on a landscape with lots and lots of fires and lots of raised fire danger index, ruling most of them out and identifying a couple that are worth having a look at, and maybe one of those you're saying, yeah, this one could blow up. So that's what we're saying that we've achieved with BUFO and what we're hoping to improve on as we develop the model. Other models can identify pyroCbs, like the work out of the US with Peterson in the Naval Research Lab, or explore stability settings such as the work that's being done in Australia by Jeff Keppert and Mika Peace. Currently, we only have one BUFO assessor, and he's talking to you at the moment. We need more, obviously, because we have days when I just don't have the time to do it. And the question becomes, how many BUFO assessors do we need, and whose names are we going to add to the list? I expect some phone calls or emails from some people listening today. It requires agency adoption and assessor training before we can get people playing in this space. And naturally, the concept links into the F-band capabilities, which is why we're, again, talking to you today. The bottom line is, prediction of blow-ups is different from, but complementary to the steady-state work which F-bands do on a routine basis. We go to the next slide. Why RUN BUFO? Studies of blow-up events show that it's often not where a fire gets to that matters, but how it gets there. So where a fire stops is often due to changes in terrain, or where a sea breeze is going to eventually get in. There are all sorts of things that almost limit what a fire can do, but how it gets there determines crew safety, or who needs to be evacuated, or which options for containment get ruled out and which options remain viable. Blow-ups can happen well away from the head fire. The image I've got in there is from late in the 2003 fires just north of the ACT, and that's the dark smoke column from a VLS event underway, the very back of what's really a vast area of fire. It's important because just downwind of it, where lots of spot fires were occurring, were 40 fire tankers marshalled in the paddock. So this is one event where it could easily have turned quite nasty because of a process that really wasn't on the agenda at that time. So the last point, recent studies have shown a strong relationship between what we've discussed and firefighter entrapment. Beyond that, which can be attributed to the dead man zone. There's some really good work that's been done just in the last 12 months on the sort of background processes that are driving entrapments, and we really need to pay more attention to this sort of work because it is vital to keep us as F-bands out of coronial inquiries. And the final dot point there, I've got the 95-5% rule. 95% of the damage is caused by 5% of the fires. So we do an excellent job as fire services in protecting the community from 95% of the fires. It's that last bit requires extra work, and our feeling is that BUFO will be a major contribution to filling that gap. Now the next slide, just a little footnote, something I've been talking to some people in AFAC about in the last few years. It has become essential that we revisit the key past fires from which lessons have been learnt. Those lessons were learnt on the assumption of steady-state fire spread, and we need to see if new lessons emerge, and if there's any evidence to justify those fires being treated as dynamic fire spread events. So we've looked at a number of the key fires, and you can probably guess what the list would be without me going into it. But there are some where it's clearly obvious now that dynamic fire spread was underway, and there's another set where it could be either dynamic or steady state. Either way, we need to revisit the list of lessons learned. The final slide, basically, that's the URL for the high fire risk website, and there's some interesting material. We'd like people to go and F-bands to go and play in there and give us some feedback or suggestions, or do we need to expand it? I know we've got lots of plans for updating that website, but I think that draws the presentation to a conclusion. I'm just looking around to see if Jason's got any. No, okay. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Rick and Jason. It's always good to see work and research that's before it hits the journals, because that takes a long time. Are there any questions of Rick or Jason?
Yeah, Mike, it's Greg. Rick, what's a soliton, please? I'm a dummy.
Yeah, okay, look, it's an interesting beastie, but mainly they've been studied in terms of tidal bores. It's a single wave that propagates a long distance without fading. And in these cases, the studies after Black Saturday suggested it's a disturbance that propagates along the top of the nocturnal inversion. But the Himawari data is showing that it's more complicated than that. But, in one sense, you could think of them as a shock wave from a major weather event. Canberra's been hit by a number of things called derechos, which are a related thing where a big thunderstorm sort of sheds this shock wave and it spreads for hundreds of kilometres across the landscape, causing havoc as it goes. We've got a lot to learn about them.
Thanks, Rick. That helps me a little bit.
If anyone can help him a lot, help me too, please.
Yeah.
It's Dan Jones here. Just got a query. The website you've got up there, highfirerisk.com.au, doesn't seem to link to anything.
It is broken today, unfortunately. We've had a number of IT issues today, and I really must apologise for the delays in starting this presentation, but it's just a nightmare at the moment. Apologies.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Rick, Dean Putting. You mentioned there's been quite a bit of work done on entrapment over the past 12 months. Who's been doing that work, and is that available somewhere?
I'll hand that over to Jason.
Yeah, so that work was...
The following has left the conference.
Glenn Daniel.
So that work was done by a research associate we had the good fortune to bring over from France, Sébastien Lahaye, who is a sort of, well, highly experienced firefighter in the French sort of area. But he came over and worked on a project which was a joint project between UNSW and New South Wales Royal Fire Service. So he spent a year pretty much collating all the entrapment episodes you could find in Australia and Europe, a couple from the US and also one from New Zealand, and basically just did an analysis of the likely contribution of various dynamic modes of fire spread to firefighter entrapment. I think we got, there should be two papers which are already available. One may be early online on International Journal of Wildland Fire, and another one we've just submitted, which is more looking at the extreme fire behaviour or dynamic fire behaviour contribution in Australia. So his surname is Lahaye, and you should be able to find that if you go through the International Journal of Wildland Fire website. I can probably also supply people with draft versions as well if they're interested.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
If there aren't any other questions, I might call it a day there. Thanks again to Jason and Rick. They're going to be presenting to the AFAC Predictive Services Group in a few weeks, which might stimulate some agency responses to this work. Just a reminder that the next webinar will be in 3 months' time. I'll get some information out about that in the next month. And for those that might be looking, Deb, you might want to mention the Centre of Excellence webinars.
Yep, so the Centre of Excellence for Prescribed Burning has got a monthly webinar series going. The next one will be on the 28th of February, and it will be Brian Levine from ACT Parks and Conservation Services talking about the decision support tool that he has built in conjunction with a number of other players and is being used around Australia. Some other topics we've got coming up are 10-year blind burning, program logic, and our objectives analysis toolbox tool that we did through the National Burning Project.
You can go to www.ada.org.au. That's AIDA.
The following has left the conference. Name not recorded.
.org.au and click on to the Knowledge Hub, and then there's a Centre of Excellence of Prescribed Burning collection there, and that links you through to the events, the webinars, and our Facebook page and our Prescribed Burning Practitioners Network as well. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thanks, Deb. And just the final reminder, if any of you have any thoughts about what presented in these webinars, then send me an email, please. Thank you very much.